Hi everyone, please take your seats. We'll start soon. Welcome back everyone. We'll start shortly as everyone gets settled back into their seats. So, what a day. We discussed, what a day. But it was a good day. It was a good, very fruitful day. And as someone who was sitting by the side, I really enjoyed all the interactions, watching everyone talk to each other, especially, like, it's been a while since I've been in a proper academic kind of talk since COVID and things like that. So it's nice. And so we discussed how justice and beauty in Muslim marriage came about. We talked about law and reform, as well as what we can learn from the Prophet himself on how to ground our relationships in justice and beauty. You got to interact with the authors, the editors, and that was great to watch. Now our speakers will talk about how we can engage with Islamic tradition and Qur'an and modern ethics to build Muslim worldviews of justice, beauty, and goodness. I welcome our speakers, Dr. Mariam Al-Attar, Dr. Mulki Al-Sharmani, and Ms. Amira Abu Talib. This session will be moderated by Ms. Faiza Vaid. So you have already been introduced to Dr. Mulki, one of the book's co-editors in the previous session. I will move on to the other speakers and moderator. Dr. Mariam Al-Attar holds a PhD in Islamic ethics from the University of Leeds. She currently teaches Arabic heritage and Islamic philosophy at the American University of Sharjah. Her research interests include meta-ethical theories, kalam and usul al-fiqh, and how these relate to contemporary normative concerns. Ms. Amira Abu Talib is currently a doctoral fellow in the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki, who holds an MA in Islamic Studies from the American University in Cairo. Her work examines the interplay between reason, ethics, and beauty, including through the concept of ihsan in the Qur'anic worldview. Our moderator for this session is Ms. Faiza Vaid. Ms. Faiza was Executive Director of Muslim Women's Network UK from September 2011 to December 2021. She joined the board in January 2022. In the 2009 Queen's New Year's Honours, Faiza was awarded an MBE for services to women's rights. She's been involved with Musawah since 2009, and we're so happy to have her today. Let's start.
Thank you very much for those introductions. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Before the break, we had a highly energized panel. Now is not the time to have a nap, okay? I think what I reflected on was that this is exactly what Musawah is about. It's about being able to bring knowledge which sparks interest, energy, thought, and isn't looking for a singular solution, right? The point is that knowledge is dynamic. Our traditions are dynamic. They are not rigid, they're not set in stone. That, as a fundamental principle, is something that some of us still have to shake off, right? So I would encourage you to shake off whatever you need to as you listen to this esteemed panel here. And I know we have 2 doctors on the panel, and inshallah, we'll have a third very soon, right? Inshallah. So the panel, the discussion that we're going to be having today is on ethics, the Qur'an, and beyond. And we've decided that each panel, a panelist will speak for 15 minutes. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it out to you. I highly encourage you to write your questions down as you hear the speakers speak. You can pass it to the front, you know, we know each other well enough now to be less formal, so pass your questions to the front, or we'll come around with the mic at the end. So I hope you enjoyed this last session, and let's go to it with an open heart, an open mind, an open will to doing what we can. So our first speaker is Dr. Mariam. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. So I hope that you will enjoy the last panel, although I feel that it is a little bit the end of the day. Maybe you are a little bit tired, but maybe you will be more energized when we seem to talk about things that are a little bit different from the things that we talked about in the morning. I mean, like we will start discussing the ethics and the relation maybe of ethics to fiqh and to other disciplines, Islamic disciplines. So, how does it go? Sorry?
Yeah.
That's it?
Yes.
Okay. My chapter focused on ethics in Islam. And indeed, when we talk about ethics or akhlaq, it has never been a separate field of study that belongs to the traditional Islamic disciplines. When we talk about the traditional Islamic disciplines, we are talking about ilm al-tafsir, the Qur'anic exegesis, ilm al-hadith, ilm al-fiqh, ilm al-kalam. Well, there is a title there which says ethics, ilm al-akhlaq. However, that wasn't usually considered as part of the traditional Islamic disciplines, since al-akhlaq, or the books that are so-called al-akhlaq, were written by those who belong to the philosophical tradition in Islam, which wasn't kind of considered as one of the traditional disciplines. We are talking about al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and of course, the famous Musawah, who in writing his book on al-akhlaq followed in the Greek tradition. So those who are known as Muslim philosophers are those who followed in the Greek philosophical tradition. So that is why most probably their work was not accepted as one of the traditional Islamic disciplines. Although, of course, when they talked about ethics, though they mainly followed Aristotle and the Aristotelian list of virtues and vices, and they elaborated on that, they often also refer to the Qur'an or to the Sunna. Anyways, when we talk about ethics as ilm al-akhlaq in our heritage in the Islam, and I still consider them part of our heritage, though they are not usually accepted as part of the traditional Islamic disciplines, we see that they have incorporated Greek philosophical tradition, which was the tradition that prevailed in that time. Now, if we look at the different Islamic disciplines, whether it is speculative theology, kalam, it is not wholly about ethics, about akhlaq. However, very important questions in ethics that are now considered as the most important questions related to meta-ethics were discussed in the works of the so-called mutakallimun, ulama al-kalam. There were mainly two schools or three schools of kalam that developed in Islam. The earliest one were the Mu'tazilite school, and then we have also the Ash'arite school. The Maturidis sometimes were closer to the Mu'tazila, and others of the Maturidis were closer to the Ash'arira. So the main question that I built upon was what is the nature of moral values, and what are the foundations of moral values? It is well known that the Mu'tazilites were so-called the defenders of reason of Islam. They thought that human being is able to know what is good and what is bad, depending on his own reason, or we can intuitively know what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. Famously, the Ash'arites opposed that, and they opposed the Mu'tazilat in almost everything that they said, and they famously held that the foundations of morality are to be found in the sacred scriptures, and that divine commands and prohibitions are the foundations of morality, and we don't ask why after that. Well, while in Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh is seen mainly as including many rules, regulations, codes of conduct. Most of them were constructed by the fuqaha. they were not discovered from the holy text. They were constructed, taken into consideration their own historical and social context. So, although my work on Islamic ethics does build upon speculative theology and mainly Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar al-Mu'tazili and touches upon fiqh as well, I would like to bring into your attention like some contemporary developments. And when we talk about contemporary developments, we are talking about like the contemporary moral philosophy. Ethics as moral philosophy, ethics as a discipline of philosophy is what I am interested in my work. So, interestingly, my chapter is called like a constructivist approach. Why constructivist approach? Because I see that most of the moral obligations or prohibitions that were developed by the fuqaha throughout the ages are constructed rather than discovered. Of course, they themselves most probably thought that they are discovering what is called the divine law in the text. However, reality is that they constructed those rules and regulations, including those rules that discriminate against women in marriage, in divorce, and in other aspects as well. When we say that those rules and regulations are constructed, I don't really mean that they are constructed like out of nothing. Of course, there is a core of universal moral values that are also shared by all human beings and emphasized in the Qur'an. So just as the previous scholars, the fuqaha, they constructed rules, regulations, and norms, we are now also in the position to construct our own codes, our own rules, our own regulations, and maybe to rewrite the marriage contract based on that. So, it is also interesting that the earliest Muslim theologians, and when we say the earliest Muslim theologians, they were the first to pose questions about the nature of morality. They were the first to pose questions about whether human beings have freedom to choose their actions or whether everything is predetermined and so on. Those first Muslim theologians actually have elaborated and considered certain conditions that need to be fulfilled for any judgment, hukum, to be considered a true moral judgment. And here I am building on the work of Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar al-Mu'tazili, who died in 1025 of the Common Era. Interestingly, the conditions of normative judgments, and when we say normative judgments, we are talking about all the rules that the fuqaha came with. The conditions of normative judgments can be two parts. Some of them are related to the agent, and some of them are related to the judgment itself. So when it comes to the agent or to the responsible moral agent who is obliged to do something or not to do something, Abdul Jabbar says, a responsible human being, mukallaf, is the one who is able to act. Al-Qudra is one of the conditions for obligations. You cannot oblige, for example, an interesting example that he would say, you cannot oblige a bird with broken wings to fly. You cannot ask somebody who is paralyzed to do things that requires you to walk. So al-Qudra, being physically, and by the way, also mentally and emotionally able to do something, is a precondition for moral obligation, or for any obligation to be considered a true moral obligation. Also, knowing, you should know how to do it, and why you are doing it is also one of the conditions of normative judgments. Living, definitely. Willing, murid. So there, it has to be, you have to be willing to do that. You don't want to be like obliged to do that without you actually want to do it. So that is mainly the necessary conditions of related to the agent. When it comes to the normative judgment itself, there are a set of presuppositions or conditions of normative judgments that need to be fulfilled in order for any hukum, normative judgment, to be considered true, moral, normative judgment. Those include purposefulness, القصد or القصدية. That is a very important concept in fiqh. Yes, it was introduced by the Mu'tazila. However, even the Ash'ari built on this, talking about, for example, maqasid al-sharia. When we say purposefulness, that means simply that a moral judgment, in order to be, or any judgment, legal judgment, in order to be valid and moral, needs to be purposeful. And just an arbitrary command or judgment is not a moral judgment then. There should be purpose behind anything that you are asked to do. There should be purpose. Rationality and objectivity. This is indeed something that Abdul Jabbar doesn't clearly explain, or he does not elaborate on that. And that is where I would like to bring in some contemporary developments in ethics, to talk about rationality and objectivity a little bit more. But in principle, when we say rationality, that means aqlaniyya, al-aql. So that means that a certain moral obligation needs to not to contradict with reason, has to be rational. We have to be rational and accept what is rational and reject what seems to contradict with basic reason or with rationality. Objectivity, of course, and that simply means that it's not the case that morality is not subjective, so it does not depend on one's preferences or one's taste. There is something objective about morality, something that everyone can agree upon, regardless of his own benefit or his own or her own preferences. Impartiality, in order for any judgment to be moral judgment, there shouldn't be kind of prefer certain group of people over others. It has to apply to everyone, regardless of his ethnicity, regardless of his or her color, regardless of his or her gender. And finally, universality. Definitely that when we talk about judgment, taklif, that wasn't for a specific group of people. It is a judgment that applies to everyone equally, all human beings, regardless of whether they are Muslims or non-Muslims. Oh, but of course, there is an important thing that we have to explain here, that they distinguish between what is called taklif al-aqli and taklif al-shar'i, or taklif al-sam'i. Taklif al-sam'i is the obligations that we cannot maybe reason sometimes. Those are related to the obligations which, like the ritual, praying, fasting, certain dietary rules that we cannot reason about them. We don't know like why exactly Muslims are asked to pray 5 times a day. There is no rationale, no reason behind that. So that is taklif al-sam'i, which is maybe specific to a group of people, to the Muslims, of course. But when it comes to taklif al-aqli, interestingly, according to Abdul Jabbar, that is a kind of obligation that includes every human being, taklif al-aqli. So, to be a rational obligation, taklif aqli, any obligation must conform to the rules of practical reason, as developed also by contemporary moral philosopher, as I argue. So what are those rules of practical reason? Maybe some of you who are familiar with modern philosophy, this will bring to your mind Immanuel Kant, because he is the most famous modern philosopher who talked about practical reason. And why not? Our predecessors, whether Farabi or others, they drew upon Greek philosophy and Aristotle. So we definitely have the right to draw upon Kant or any other Western philosopher whose thought does not contradict with the basic Islamic teachings. So the main criteria to reject somebody, maybe if somebody actually his thought contradicts certain basic Islamic teachings, but if it does not and it is beneficial for expanding a certain concept, that there is no problem with that, according to many Islamic thinkers in the past. So the rules of practical reason, I think, is first of all that a rule should entail that acting accordingly is absolutely mandatory. So a certain rule should entail that acting accordingly is absolutely mandatory. That seems to require some explanation, because when we are talking about a rule, usually rules that are not rational, rules that are not universal, rules that are partial, definitely acting accordingly is not absolutely mandatory. However, the rules that are ethical rules are rules that we see that they are important to follow. In other words, we can say that the rule that treat other people the way you want to be treated if you are in the same situation, that is a moral rule which has to be followed regardless. Also, another rule, a moral rule cannot be overruled by considerations that do not belong to the domain of ethics. And this is important because when we talk about considerations that do not belong to the domain of ethics, sometimes those are considerations that are usually developed by certain fuqaha that have nothing to do with morality and have no impact on the well-being of other people. Those are not really moral rules, and if those contradict with morality, definitely the morality has to be given priority over those rules. Consistency, of course, like any rule, has to be consistent. It cannot ask you to do something and not to do it in the same time. It can't ask you to, for example, give priority to your own benefit and at the same time to take into consideration the best of other people around you, including yourself. Now, of course, it has to be applicable to all individuals without exception. And when we say that, it means that it has to be applicable to men and women, just to bring that all to the context of this gathering, which is equality in marriage and justice in marriage. So any rule has to be applicable to all, men or women, in order to be considered a moral rule. If it is not, if it applies only to women or only to men, that is not a moral rule for sure. And you know what? God is just, so he wouldn't impose a certain rule on men or on women only and not consider equality and justice. And finally, a moral rule should be for the good of all equally. I am finishing. So, knowing now the necessary conditions of moral judgments that draws on Islamic intellectual heritage, since the first one to articulate them was Qadi Abdul Jabbar, of course, he himself building on the work of others, and contemporary ethical thought provides us with a rational tool to expose any judgment which presupposes what is false or fails to satisfy these conditions. All the rules that discriminate against women, including the rules of marriage and divorce that were discussed before in this panel, are constructed and clearly fail to satisfy the conditions of rational obligation. Thus, they should not be considered part of the divinely ordained morality or Sharia, which is first and foremost, I think, an ethical paradigm. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mariam, very much. I'm going to ask you just one question. Okay, I'll let you sit down first. So your chapter, I mean, reading it, I have to say, I had to read it slowly. It is intense, but necessarily so. Because actually the concepts need work. And I don't want that, I don't say that to discourage people. I think this is the efforts that we need to put into understanding these basics, actually, which I know I don't have fully understood. So your chapter includes several examples of different socio-historical contexts and their influence. You spoke to us about, to begin with, the influence of Greek philosophy, for example. In your opinion, what are the most influential socio-historic factors today that could enable gender equality?
Well, when we talk about socio-historical factors, actually, I talk about that in order to explain how the ahkam, the judgments, are actually all constructed. Unlike the moral values of the Quran that my friends Amira and Mulki are going to talk about. So, al-ihsan, al-adl, al-birr, those are moral values that are instilled in us and are also written in our Holy Scripture. But when we are talking about judgment, those are constructed, taking the morality into consideration, but also the context, the historical and the social context of the time. So let's say when it is mentioned that الرجال قوامون على النساء, that applied during the medieval Muslim scholars, the fuqaha, understood that to mean that men are above, or they are superior to women. And any rule that was built on that understanding and that social context where really men had advantage, and maybe they were superior to women, most of them, but not all. We have seen that example of Khadija, for example. She was a really powerful woman. But for today, there is kind of paradigm shift in the way the people think, the way the women feel about themselves and their relation with men. Nowadays, nobody, like most of the women that I know at least, would never accept that men are superior over them just because of their gender. Because now we see that most of the women, not most of the women, but many women are really well educated. Many of them have different jobs. So still talking about superiority of men over women is not related to this context. So we have to construct different norms that take this new socio-historic fact into consideration, just as the scholars of the past or the medieval fuqaha have constructed their norms and rules based on the socio-historic fact of the past. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're now going to hear from Dr. Mulki. And Mulki, I may be less polite with a time count if you miss it, okay?
Yes, but tell me 15 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
But we want fairness and justice.
Of course, of course.
Right? Yeah. So everybody, thank you so much for staying with us and continuing being interested. We are really honored to have you. This is a joint work with my really good friends and intellectual partners, spiritual partners, I would say Professor Umayma Abu Bakr from Cairo University, with extensive work and publications in tafsir and Qur'an, and the very well-known Moroccan scholar of Islam and gender with a lot of publications in Arabic and French translated into English, Asma Lamrabit. Unfortunately, they couldn't be here, but they will be with us in Cairo, inshallah, in the second launch. And so we worked this together. Basically, our aim was, is there such thing as a coherent Qur'anic ethical framework for marriage? Does the Qur'an has an ethical paradigm for marriage? And methodologically, how can we arrive at that? And what are the implications if we can shed light on that, systematically study it, highlight it? What are the implications for the hierarchical model of marriage that we have in classical jurisprudence and reflected in many of our contemporary Muslim family laws? But we also locate this work within a scholarship that is really growing and thriving, that is systematically studying the Quran as an important source of Islamic ethics, systematically studying it. We would say, we would probably think, duh, that's of course, Quran is the primary source, and it's for Muslims from Islamic theology, it's a divine text, shouldn't be a source of Islamic ethics, but it hasn't really been studied systematically as a source of Islamic ethics. So there are scholars who've been really taken up this effort. Earlier scholars like Muhammad Daraz, like the Japanese scholar Toshiko Isutsu, and contemporary scholars, among them my colleagues here, Niveen Rida, my colleague Amira Abu Talib, who you will hear from next, definitely African-American theologian and a very important partner and collaborator with us in Musawah, Amina Wadoud, and Khalid Abul Fadl. So we are locating this effort also. It's about gender equality. It's about understanding the Quran, if there is a Quranic ethical paradigm, revisiting the fiqh model. But it's also about what can we learn about Quran as a source of ethics, not as a source of law. It doesn't mean we are negating that it's a source of norm, but we are interested in the relationship between ethics and norms in the Quran. Okay. So in this study, we focus very closely with the Quran. So does that mean we haven't dealt with the tafsir? No. And we shouldn't, because the tafsir is a very important part of interpretive tradition. There's a lot to learn from it. It tells us a lot about, for example, how patriarchal concepts came about. It tells us a lot also about how they themselves grappled with the ethical, the differences among them. We've done that in previous studies that Umayma published by herself, a very important chapter in our Men in Charge. Asma did that. Umayma and I worked together, and we studied all the divorce verses in the Quran and adopting an ethically oriented reading, and we published that. So we've done that before, but this time, and based on that previous work and having the tafsir in the background and being informed by it, we wanted to highlight some methodological features, you could say, but also gaps that we're taking issue with in the tafsir in terms of atomistic reading, piecemeal, verse by verse. Being aware of ethics sometimes, it's not like they weren't aware of the ethical concept in the Quran, but no systematic really study and consistent study of ethical, and no systematic study of the relationship between ethical and normative things in the Quran that they drive and base their rulings on. And also the role of their patriarchal norms in that context. Does that mean we are free from our own norms? Of course not. Everybody, every reader, we also are a product of our context. We claim that, we acknowledge that, we are upfront about it, but we are arguing that also the patriarchal norms of their time had a role in their methodology, in shaping methodology. So in this study, we are cognizant of these gaps. Part of our aim is also to put forward a new methodology, and we're trying to explore the Quranic, investigate if there's a such thing as Quranic ethical framework for marriage. Therefore, based on that, we adopted this methodology with these elements, holistic and thematic, meaning our starting point is that we argue, and we try to prove that rigorously, hopefully, and you judge for yourself when you read the chapter, that when we read all the verses in the Quran, we first of all need to read them thematically. So we grouped all the marriage, divorce, parenting verbs together. There were over 60. Holistically, because our hypothesis was they constitute a coherent whole, and we try to prove that hypothesis. So we grouped them thematically, try to see how they speak to one another, and together, do they speak to something larger? And how they're also located in central theological principles and messages in the Quran. Now, I'll come back to the ethically oriented, which is a very key element of our methodology, but intertextual, so which is the tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, and this is not something we invented. Our esteemed exegetes were also aware of that. So we look also at individual verses in their textual context. What are the verses that appear before? What are the verses that come after? And it's not haphazard. What can we deduce from that? How can we connect also some verses to other verses because either of a similar issue or certain key terms that are occurring. You know, for example, Ziba mentioned earlier today, qawamun and qawameen, where they occur, nushuz, for example, and other key terms. So this leads me to the linguistics. So we paid attention also to the linguistic understanding of the key terms, particularly around marriage, divorce, and parenting. And Qur'an is revealed in a particular context with a particular history, but it's, according to traditional Islamic theology, it's a divine text that is supposed to be universal and relevant to Muslims or those who believe in it beyond that. But its historicity cannot be denied, and it is, so we also were very cognizant and paying close attention in our methodology in its historical dimension. What is the particular context it's addressing, and what does that say towards the overall coherent ethical worldview that we're trying to explore and see if it exists? So based on that methodology, and after many, many, many meetings together, I don't know, my colleagues would know, I don't know, 1 year and a half, 2 years maybe, and it was really intellectually and spiritually very, very, very rich, and we should talk about that if people are interested, the process of working together as well. I'm sure my other colleagues who co-authored will have something to say about that. So we are arguing, yes, there is a Qur'anic ethical paradigm for marriage. There is an ethical framework that the Qur'an is putting forward for marriage, and we are saying you can visualize it as 3 concentric circles, or 3 what we call them discursive circles, and they're intertwined. And the very first one, it starts when we want to understand what Qur'an has to say about marriage, about divorce and parenting. We are arguing based on this text and adopting this methodology. You have to start first with a theological and ethical foundation, which says, according to the Qur'an, that we all share ontological equality. We are all created from nafsin wahida. And we all share, ya ayyuhan nas, all of us share the responsibility of taqwa. Now, taqwa sometimes in conventional understanding among Muslims, we understand it as fear God, do what's right, do what's wrong. That's part of it, but that's not really doing justice to the layered meanings of the term, particularly in the way it occurs in the Qur'an. And therefore, we left it untranslated. And we argue, and there are other scholars who've argued before us, we build on their work like Amina Wadud, it's about really living a life of God consciousness. It's about exercising moral agency in everything you do in this world, and certainly in how you relate to people and treat them. So that's the very first building block, the first foundation. The second then is that marriage is a solemn bond. It's a bond emotionally, spiritually, physically, but certainly ethically, right? And then this is the second one, and then it rests on 3 pillars. These 3 pillars are sakan, resting abode, mawadda, affection, and rahmah, compassion. So how do we get there? I'll take you to the verses. Most of the verses on the Qur'an about marriage and divorce and parenting, they're everywhere, but most of them, as I think Niveen mentioned earlier this morning, and several of my colleagues, in Surah An-Nisa, as well as Surah Al-Baqarah. So we say in Surah An-Nisa, which is, chapter 4, it is not haphazard how this verse starts with this verse, which we argue is a foundational verse. And God saying, Ya ayyuhan nas, so you right away establishing that this is a universal principle, right? And then the idea of ontological equality, Ya ayyuhan nas, ittaqu rabbukum alladhi khalaqakum min nafsin wahida. One soul, one essence, wa khalaqa minha zawjaha, duality, pair, equal pair, right? And then plurality, وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً, plurality right away. And then taqwa, this moral agency, this very layered mandate that we all share, right, about doing the good, living a life of God presence, is repeated twice. So we argue this is a foundational verse that is telling us something very important theologically and ethically that we need to keep in mind every time we think about specific aspect of marriage, whether it's polygyny, whether it's dower, and we do that later on in our chapter. Then the second foundation, which is marriage as a solemn bond, it occurs in a unit of verses. And here it will be clear a little bit our methodology of intratextuality. And the third one also I'll show you. That, okay, and this is a verse that also shows the historical dimension of the Quran. Certainly it's addressing a particular context, trying to reform certain practices that were very discriminatory against women, inheriting women, men exploiting women so that they don't give them their dower, and depriving them from their financial dues. And then comes at the end this principle that mithaq ghalizan, and then again, as part of our methodology, we looked at how that term occurs in many other verses in the Quran, and some of the key verses where it occurs, it talks about God's relationship and covenant with prophets. And we are arguing that this is not haphazard. This is not haphazard. The same term that is used about God and the prophets is also used, prophets, the bond between two spouses, right? And that it's ghaliz, it's solemn. Then I come to the third one, the three pillars, right? And this occurs in Surah Al-Rum. ومن آياته أن خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها وجعل بينكم مودة ورحمة إن في ذلك لآيات لقوم يتفكرون. And the three pillars, and again, when we look at where this verse occurs as a part of a unit of verses before and after, you'll see that the whole unit of verses is about really stressing and highlighting and giving examples of the signs of God, ayat, the signs of God's ability, God's goodness, and then also talking about pairs, equal pairs. So here it's about spouses, two who are in marriage. Before that and after that, it talks about day and night. Heaven and death, life and death, heaven and sky, and we're heaven and earth. So we are arguing this is not haphazard either. If we adopt that kind of reading, it then specifies that this is a foundational verse. This is telling us something very important according to the Quranic vision of marriage, that there are these three pillars that's supposed to be really the what we establish marriage on. Second, mawadda, rahma. And taking you back to the first one, ontological equality and shared mandate of of moral agency. How am I doing? 5 minutes. Okay. Yes. So just to remind you of the concentric circles, these are these three concentric circles. This is our main paradigm that we are arguing. And then in the rest of the chapter, we read very specific aspects of marriage, divorce, as discussed within the Quran, within this paradigm that we're putting forward, or ethical framework as we call it in the chapter. So we look at dower, we look at polygyny, we look at marital discord, and we look at marital intimacy as well. We've looked at other aspects as well, but it's only one book chapter, and we hope, inshallah, that maybe we can continue. And our co-editors were telling us you're writing too much, right? So what is the implication? We are arguing, if we adopt this methodology, and by no means we are arguing this is the only methodology that you can use to read and study the Quranic ethics of marriage. But we are saying this is one methodology, perhaps, that can make the case that the Quran has an ethical vision of marriage, a coherent ethical vision of marriage. And definitely, when we read it carefully, right, and if we are persuaded and we follow the argument, definitely it is at odds with the model of marriage, the hierarchical model of marriage that we have in classical jurisprudence, as well as in modern family laws that draw on the fiqh. This hierarchy, this idea of men and women ontologically being different, inherently being different, morally being different, and there are a lot of examples, different in self, or one being superior, one being inferior, right? It is at odds with it. And this is something I think that came up about in also Yasmin's argument and others as well. Okay, what are the implications then? I think we are arguing that there's several implications. One is on an individual level, and one we can talk about norms in terms of legal reform. On the individual level, if one thinks this text is important for them ethically, normatively, away from laws, then as an individual, there's a duty to really study and understand this ethical framework. What is the overall coherent ethical Quranic vision of marriage, and how do we really live that kind of marriage individually for those who want to go there, right? But it also means methodologically, even if we don't want to live that kind of marriage, if we want to understand what Qur'an has to say about marriage, our chapter is saying, it's putting forward this argument that we need to read the Qur'an differently. We need to read it differently when we want to understand its norms on marriage. It does not work anymore to say, okay, in Surah Al-Baqarah, it said this verse on divorce, end of story. Or in Surah Al-Nisa, it said that. That won't work. So we are also saying individually, even if you don't want to live that kind of marriage, or you're incapable, and there's so many other things, if you want to know what the Quran says about the marriage, we have to read and interpret the Quran differently. Legally, it means, and this is a message and a question that we are emphasizing in our book and in our project, the importance of really, again, connecting ethics and law. And it doesn't mean it's a straightforward, but we are, and of course there can be patriarchal ethics and egalitarian ethics. In this project, we are interested in how do you get to the egalitarian ethics and make a case from it from within the tradition, and that's what we've been hearing today. But how can we connect, how can our laws, whether they are codified or uncodified, but we are important for us and we live by them, how can they reflect that egalitarian ethics that is, we are saying, is in the Quran, or also Maryam is saying there are also these universal moral values that we all can agree on by reason, or from other sources as well. How can they be reflected in our laws? And I just want to highlight, that it was a real pleasure and privilege and a blessing and ni'mah, and for me to have worked with these two amazing women. For 2 years, we had so many meetings on Zoom, sometimes on Messenger when Zoom didn't work, and endless emails, and we really worked together. We read all these verses together. We had lots of discussions, and it was a true, not just intellectual journey, a true spiritual journey for me, and I'm humbled and I'm thankful. And thank you for your interest and your attention.
Thank you, Mulki. No, you didn't. You have 1 minute and 25 seconds remaining. No, you're going to claim it back now. So thank you very much. I think we could feel the passion and what this work means to you. So thank you for sharing it with us today. When I was reading the chapter, we've heard today lots of misconceptions. And in the chapter, you mention another misconception, and that is the understanding of Eve's role. And we would have all heard at some point her creation from Adam's crooked rib. So can you I think this is a good opportunity to remind us what is actually said in the Quran, and coming back to yourself.
Exactly. Thank you, Faiza. That's an important question. And it's a question that has been dealt with by many scholars. So because it's an important. Of course, those of us who are familiar with Arabic, you will see that Eve is not mentioned by name at all. And also, if we go back to that foundational verse, Surah An-Nisa, ayah raqam 1, it says, Ya ayyuha nas, اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة. Nafs is نفس واحدة, right? It's feminine. And then وخلق منها زوجها. And زوجها is masculine. But also in Arabic, it doesn't mean it's a man or it's a woman. It just means it's a mate, a pair consisting of two. So linguistically, there is no way you can make the case, this is Adam and this is Eve, right? And there are certainly, so on a linguistic level, that is not there. And in the tafsir, that's something that, also, I would say it has come in from the biblical tradition, but also I am a bit cautious also about blaming everything on Israeliyat, because I think that's not a good approach either, to say, oh, everything bad came from Christian and Jewish tradition and we've got it right. I think that doesn't serve us anything. It doesn't serve us well, and it's not rigorous way of engaging with a very important text, and they're part of an Abrahamic tradition. So I want to say that cautiously. But in the Tabari and other Mufassirin, then they have all these very elaborate narratives about Eve and the crooked rib and the devil and very elaborate narratives, which is very interesting. In the university, we teach this course, a comparative course, three of us, where we look at women in sacred texts, in the Abrahamic texts, in Christianity, in Islam, and in Judaism, and we look at these things. And I also want to say, a lot of people have written about it, but also we have a PhD student who have systematically studied this particular human creation story in our tafasir, the Shia and the Sunna, adopting Umayma Abu Bakr's approach that she proposed in Men in Charge. She was very much influenced by Umayma and our work. And she did that as well as in Judaism. So she's comparing the two traditions, and she will be defending soon. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Okay, last but certainly not least, the future Dr. Amira.
Yeah, it's on. Thank you. No, we don't. Yes. Thank you very much. Well, I'm humbled and thankful that Mulki is my supervisor, and you could see what kind of person she is. And I'm also thankful for Miza for the wonderful MC job that she's been doing. And for the men that we have in the group, I really, really am privileged and touched that you are here. I love that the women are here too, but for men to be here, it has a lot of meaning. So today I want to talk about my chapter that is titled Ihsan, a mandate for beauty and goodness in family relations. Before I start that, though, I had a question for you, and you don't have to answer, but you have to think about it. If you were to ask the first 100 people that you see wherever you live, whether in a Muslim minority country here or a Muslim majority country, what would be the first 5 words that came to your mind when you hear the word Islam? Just think about that. I could think of many negative things, and I could think of maybe some okay things. Negative meaning, terror, Islamophobia, jihad. Maybe some will say prayer, maybe some will say Hajj. I don't know what came to your mind, but maybe we could put it to the test. My point is, do you think that any of those 5 words are going to be beauty? Yes? No? Okay. That's what my point is here, and that's what I want to talk about. So basically what I want to address is the ihsan paradigm in the Qur'an, and I'll show you what that means, and this is coming as a result of my doctoral investigation. And then I want to talk about how that speaks to family as a building block of society, and end with the issues and the way forward. For those of you who are not Arabic speakers, the term ihsan is based on the root husn, which has this unique capacity of combining the meanings of beauty and goodness into one. When I say goodness, I mean goodness in terms of being kind and doing charitable work and moral beauty, but it also means goodness in terms of perfection and precision and doing a job well. So it's really kind of an all-encompassing term, and unfortunately, it doesn't have an equivalent in the English language. This root appears 194 times in the Qur'an, and this is the basis of my research. So what I'm doing in terms of methodology, I'm not going to repeat what Mulki said, but I'm using a similar approach, where I'm looking at the Qur'an holistically, and I look at each and every one of those 194 occurrences. I examine what themes they are in, and then try to build connections between them based on an intratextual tafsir Qur'an bil Qur'an. But then I also look at the tafsir, and I use a sample of traditional seminal tafsir works to see what they understood and how they interpret ihsan in those particular themes. So ihsan paradigm, in a simple manner, is basically a self-perpetuating cycle where it says in the Qur'an that God is the ultimate beauty and goodness, ahsan al-khaliqeen, and I'll show you some of the verses that I used to build this paradigm. That everything that God has created has been created with ihsan, so this notion of beauty and goodness is imbued into all of creation, including human beings. However, the human being has a sense of agency and volition. There is a natural universal harmony that exists based on everything being created with precision, based on a system, with beauty, with goodness, and nature follows that naturally. However, the human being is given a sense of agency, like I just said, that can live in sync with this universal harmony by manifesting ihsan, or can choose to live out of sync. And most of us probably live in between. We do wonderful things, but we also do things that are not so wonderful. So to share the verses, this is basically, if you see those two triangles, those two inverted triangles, so it's basically ihsan coming from above, being permeating the universe that we live in, and then the human beings asked to reciprocate. This idea is not unique to Islam or the Qur'an. Even in the Hermetic tradition, the ancient Egyptian tradition, and many other civilizations, it's the idea of as above, so below. But here I wanted to share with you some of the verses. So in Surah 23, verse 14, فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ, just like I said, God is the utmost host. God's message, Allahu nazzala ahsan al-hadith. So the message of God is a message of beauty and goodness, that everything is created with ihsan. الَّذِي أَحْسَنَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ خَلَقَهُ. Here what's interesting is that for those of you who can read Arabic, the same ahsan, ahsan, ahsan is used in those three verses, except the first two, it's used in a nominal sense in terms of a superlative. So the most beautiful, the most good. But in the third case in Surah 32, this is a verb. It's the verb of creation. The verb of creation is to make beautiful and to make good. There's many more, but I'm not going to go into them here, including, of course, the creation. خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. So now, what is the mandate upon the human being? It says here, أَحْسِنْ كَمَا أَحْسَنَ اللَّهُ إِلَيْكَ وَلَا تَبْغِ الْفَسَادَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. So reciprocate the ihsan that has been endowed into you and do not corrupt. This is a very loose translation, of course. But basically what this verse is saying is that it's creating this spectrum of morality, where on the lower end you have corruption, injustice, transgression, and on the opposite end you have manifesting beauty and goodness. What's in the middle between those two is fairness, is justice. So ihsan, to be accomplished, has to come above justice. This is reinforced in 1690, where it's a very stern command, one of the very few of that kind of tone of voice that appears in the Qur'an that says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ. So there are two things, they're not one thing, and both of them are a mandate. It's interesting when you look at tafasir, which I won't really go into except one here, Ibn Kathir, which is the most widespread tafsir in the world today. Ibn Kathir, when he explains this verse, he says that God commands justice and recommends ihsan. Even though the terminology is the same exact term, the same exact verb, but this is how interpretation can be different. So this is the ihsan paradigm here, and like I said, it shows that justice is a middle step. Transgression, injustice, humiliation, all the negative stuff, all the ugliness tips the scale to the lower end, everything that's beautiful and good. And by the way, I will never say what beauty and goodness is. This is a very relative thing, but I'm talking conceptually. So how does that fit into this discussion when we talk about gender and family and marriage and life? If we have laws that are unjust, how are we expected to live up to the claim? How are we expected as believers to live up to the mandate of the Qur'an? Because ihsan has to come above justice. You can't be unjust and be a muhsin in the same context, of course. You have to surpass that, and the Qur'an mandates that. So now let's go into the idea of family. And I'll use Mulki's idea of the concentric circles. And Mulki talked about nafs wahida. So this nafs wahida is mandated to manifest beauty and goodness just as it had been endowed into it. But then there's the zawj, the partner. And then there's the offspring, the parents and the offspring. And the circles that I'm putting here are circles where ihsan has been mandated at every one of those levels. And this is what I'm trying to share with you here. And then there's the qurba. Some people understand it as relatives. Some people understand it as those in your vicinity. And then the Qur'an mandates on several occasions ihsan, of course, starting with the walidain and all of this, but it goes to the yatama and the masakin. This is very important because when it builds family as the building block of society, and healthy families that is, with healthy dynamics, then it talks about the people that don't have families, the orphans that don't have families to support them. A true believer is mandated to manifest beauty and goodness towards orphans, but not only orphans, to al-masakin. And al-masakin could be different from al-fuqara, which are the poor. They might be vulnerable because they're poor, but they could also be vulnerable because of other situations or conditions or context. And we can think about how many people we have ostracized in our communities, and the command to include them in your circle of beauty and goodness. But what becomes really interesting, and think in my opinion, is that oftentimes we think of ihsan as beauty and goodness, all this fluffy stuff that you do once everything is settled and you manage, the basics, then you do all the nice things. Actually, the Qur'an mandates ihsan in the most difficult of times. And this is where the conundrum happens, because it requires a lot of effort. So, when it comes to parent-child or parent-offspring relationship, okay, it's normal for us to think about, in healthy conditions, that when we have children, we have this instinctive desire to take care of our kids. We derive happiness and joy from actually nurturing our children. Seeing them happy makes us happy. Again, not all families are like that, but I'm talking about the healthy norm. The Qur'an doesn't mandate parents to show ihsan to their kids. It shows it in the opposite situation, when the tables turn, when the parents are old and fragile and feeble, and the children are no longer children. They're adults with responsibilities, with children maybe of their own, with lives. That's when they need to manifest beauty and goodness towards the older parents. This is a very difficult time. I'm sure most of you at least know people who are in that condition where they have to take care of older family members. And it becomes a very, very stressful, causing a lot of distress. It's interesting here, and of course anybody that reads the Qur'an with any level of engagement would have come across bil-walidayn ihsan and this mandate to show beauty and goodness to parents on many occasions. What's fascinating is that when we look at the tafsir tradition, in most cases, the mufassirun just repeat the term ihsan. So if the ayah says ahsinu, then the mufassir says ahsinu. And this says two things. One, that this term is so internalized into the culture that it doesn't really need explanation. But it also might indicate that it's a very complex term and it's very hard to decipher or to address. Plus, the mufassirin weren't always very adamant about unpacking the ethical components. They were much more interested in doing all the very practical stuff. So when it comes to bil-walidayn ihsan, and when you look at the tafsir, you'll find that beauty is everywhere. It talks about having this beautiful relationship with your parents and showing them not only kindness, but humility, and not only physical care, but emotional care. So it really, you get the really kind of this beautiful essence about ihsan when you read the little of it that they speak about in the interpretations. But what about other situations? What about marriage? So just like I was talking about situations where there's a sense of spontaneity with your children and how you have to make a deliberate effort with an older parent, I feel the same exists with relationships in terms of partnership. In the Qur'an, and Mulki had this verse up, جَعَلْنَا بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. So the Qur'an posits this situation, the relationship and couplehood between those two axes, between a love, a mawadda, that could be spontaneous, where the person derives joy from making the other one happy. If any of you have ever been in love, and I hope this is the case, you know what I mean. You feel joy when the person is happy, okay? And on the other side of the spectrum, there's empathy, there's compassion. Hopefully there'll be both. But sometimes marriages don't have the love, or they have love doesn't continue. But this is where this goodness comes in, that people still show empathy and care and compassion. And then, just like I said, ihsan is mandated at the difficult times. Ihsan is not mandated at the times where we're all lovey-dovey. That's not the case. Ihsan is mandated in the Qur'an in turbulent times. So in Surah Al-Baqarah, which Niveen had earlier mentioned, sets the stage for the entire Qur'an. It's the covenant itself. So in this surah, it says, الطلاق مرتان فإمساك بمعروف أو تسريح بإحسان. So divorce can happen twice, and then you either hang on to each other in what is commonly known to be good, or you let go in beauty and goodness. Now, how far away is that from the divorce cases that you hear about, or that we see in the media? It's very far, and there's very little emphasis on that. And I'll share with you what the Mufassirin say about this verse. But before I do that, I'll just share another verse quickly. Also in the relationship where there is a sense of alienation and distress, it talks about the end of this verse, وَأَن تَحْسِنُوا وَتَتَّقُوا فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرٌ. So again, a situation of marital distress, and it talks about try to bring peace, but overall, you need to put forth beauty and goodness. So now let's quickly look at the tafsir. So all focus on legislation. The tafsir, if you look at, I look at 6 seminal works, all of them take 90% of the interpretive space to talk about what it means to divorce twice, like legally, juristic things, practical stuff. They all only address the husband, as if the Qur'an was only written for the man. And this is unfair for the men, because this command to show beauty and goodness at times of alienation and at times of divorce is, the woman is accountable for that too. A lot of women can be, shrewd, can manifest a lot of ugliness, just as men do. I mean, it's human nature, unfortunately, sometimes that at times of distress, brings out the worst in us. So what the Qur'an is mandating is at that particular time, when we are most prone to at least not be beautiful, oftentimes to be unjust, or to want to have this sense of rivalry and win or power dynamic, this is the time when ihsan is commanded. And just as Mulki had mentioned, because the Mufassirin look at verse by verse, they don't look at any holistic picture, it's just how the tradition has been constructed, that they don't look at things conceptually. So ihsan is not addressed as this concept of beauty and goodness, it's addressed as a term in this verse, if they address it, because oftentimes it's not even addressed. In one case, it will mean, be beautiful to parents, and others. And I'll show you a couple of examples here, 4 examples. So Al-Tabari, his name came up many times today. So Al-Tabari, in the 10th century, said, of course, ihsan repeated it as it is, but then he added to it that you have to be fair, the husband has to be fair, pay the financial dues, and not harm the wife. Well and good. Zamakhshari, 12th century, he also said similar things, and he said that it's a mandate that the husband doesn't prolong the waiting period, the iddah, by remarrying her again, or for those of you who know the logistics of it, or that he doesn't do that with the intentional harm to just keep her hanging. Razi also spoke about financial dues and not to badmouth the wife. Particularly, he said not to cause the society to be repulsed by the wife or saying bad things about her. And Ibn Kathir, who's again the most popular tafsir today, even in non-Arabic speaking societies, he said it means to avoid injustice. Well, are they wrong? I don't think they're wrong, but they're saying, of course, one should be fair and one should be just and not harm the wife, and the wife shouldn't harm the husband. But to me, this looks like it's just justice. It looks like it's just a call for being fair and just. Where's the command for ihsan here? It doesn't exist. When we look at gender relationships in the tradition, they're looking from a very different lens. And this have been maybe groundbreaking at the time, when women didn't have a financial identity, maybe asking the husband to pay her dues, to not harm her. Maybe this was avant-garde then. But we can't live in today's society and build our rules and regulations on jurisprudence and interpretations that were 700 years old. I'm talking if we take the latest, you know. Most of the time we even go further back. So, and we can't look at these, you know, esteemed scholars and say that they were wrong. They might have tried their best, and maybe this was very progressive. But we, just like they engaged their mind and they tried to improve the conditions of their societies, we have an obligation to do the same thing. And we also have to keep in mind that as human beings, we develop, we evolve. Hopefully we progress. We have something called human rights. So all of this has to come into play. So even though ihsan is very prevalent in the interpretive tradition and in our societies, even in non-Arabic speaking Muslim societies, ihsan is a word that everybody can identify with. But it's never looked at in a significance overall, you know, arching concept in the Qur'an, that there is this very clear, very repeated, insistent call to manifest ihsan, to put forth beauty and goodness. So, to end, I'm suggesting a two-way positionality here. We spoke a lot about how Musawah looks at things from the ground up and from the top down. So kind of using that model, what we can do is we can combat injustice, which is what mostly we have been trying to do, is trying to identify the areas where there are problems, the laws that are unjust, trying to look at a book like Men in Charge that tried to really deconstruct the, you know, the concepts of qawama and wilaya and how they were constructed and how they're man-made constructs. So, and trying to reconcile what we have happening on the ground with what we think should be. Now, that's one approach to improving things. But another approach, and whenever you try to, there's always going to be good and bad in the world. So one way is to fight evil, but another way is to spread goodness. And this is the other position, where we stand in the middle, where we can think about spreading beauty. And instead of looking down and seeing all the ugliness and only focusing on fixing that, which is necessary, by the way, I'm not saying we should, you know, disregard that, but we can open the door for new kinds of conversations, for new worlds. So instead of reconciling, we can elevate and aspire. And maybe when we do that, in decades down the road, when people hear about the term Islam, beauty might come to mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There we are. Thank you very much. I'm going to hold my questions in the interest of fairness. And we'll take questions from the audience. But as Musawah is a knowledge-building movement, as we've heard today, and my burning question is, how do we make this knowledge more accessible? So I'm going to ask you also, maybe you want to share one piece of knowledge that you're taking away with you today, and what action may you be taking too? So feel free to raise your hand with a question, but if you've got an answer to mine, I'd be really happy to hear. We'll take a couple at a time, Zareen. I think we've got two there. Zobia, do you want to go first? Not on, hun.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to know, like, from Musawah's perspective, if they've ever come across or had experience with, like, Sharia panels, which is where you have the practice of the law outside of the legal justice system. So although in Muslim minority countries will be using Sharia's panels at some point if they're going through a Muslim divorce, sometimes for inheritance, all sorts of other issues. And anyone who's come across them will find that they're quite devoid of ihsan. They're not ihsan-centric. They're literal, cold, and they don't have the morality and the ethics or the spirituality. They're seen as too soft, potentially. And I just wondered, with such a need, would Musawah ever consider a panel, a Sharia panel, where there's such a need in the community for ihsan-centric action for those women who have nowhere to go?
Okay, we'll take the next question as well.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Arif and I'm currently studying here at SOAS, alhamdulillah. And with regards to the statement made, I would like to share that I feel very blessed to be here and to learn a lot about ihsan and about gender relations. I think it's very important. Coming from Malaysia, it's a very big challenge there and here, of course. So I'm grateful for the opportunity and to engage with everyone. I think the takeaway point, I've got a statement and also a question. The takeaway point is to have these kind of discussions would allow for an opportunity to also look at our privileges. And as a man, obviously, so many privileges that I have. And to not challenge, but question and to engage with ihsan. And I think it's important for men and women to realize that the potentiality is there for us to reach this level of love and mahabbah and mawaddah and sakina and all these terms that are beyond rigid legality, I think. Again, legal matters are very important, but at the end of the day, the core of everything is that level of realizing that we're all in this together and we don't choose where we come from, we don't choose the trajectories of our lives, really. It really depends on how we look at things. My question is with regards to ihsan and with such organizations as Musawah and Sisters in Islam in Malaysia. How much of a challenge is it when we have people who perhaps think of these organizations as being also linked to the LGBTQ movement, QI, and sometimes this idea that Musawah advocates for these same-gendered relations. Because when we talk about family, obviously, looking at history and looking at the concepts that we have today, it's about also progeny and the protection of progeny. We have that in the Maqasid Sharia, right? Protection of lineage. So how does one actually reconcile these ideas? And for the lack of a better word, the hijacking of these elements within organizations like Musawah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Ziba, did you want to come in on the first one? No? Okay.
You can answer both. Yeah. We're gonna share the labor. Do you want to just stand first?
Okay, we're going to take, we'll take one more.
Sure.
Yeah?
Okay. So thank you for a great panel. I really learned a great deal. My question is for Mariam. There are so few scholars who do kalam really well, and I greatly appreciate your work and everybody on this panel's work. So Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar was a Shafi'i, and he was a Mu'tazili scholar. I'm wondering the conditions for moral judgments that you outlined so beautifully, how acceptable would they be in contemporary mainstream Shafi'i thinking today? Yeah, thank you.
I invite my colleagues also to pitch in, right? And thank you everybody for your questions and your comments. About the Sharia Council, if I understood your question correctly, were you saying that you were advocating or suggesting that we engage with the Sharia Council, or that we establish a Sharia Council? I wasn't sure which one was it. Okay. Establish a Sharia Council. We go back to what we said this morning. We are a knowledge building movement, right? And we believe the importance of marrying organically scholarship and activism. So we produce knowledge, and also, like my colleague Sarah said, also really shedding light on how different forms of knowledge are important and giving them the space to claim their authority, like the knowledge coming from the lived reality, and then disseminating that knowledge, engaging with religious scholars we do in different parts of the world, but nobody can do everything, and nobody should do everything. That doesn't do us well, because then that also creates a space for where people can end up having a singular vision. Collectivity and collaboration is very important. That's how we change, and change takes time. So I would say, of course, I'm not the only one in Musawah, but I would say that's not a path we want to go there. Right? No, it's not. I don't think it's our job to do Sharia counsel, but we work with different kinds of people, and people can take this knowledge, produce knowledge themselves, and then take it back. But what we do, and we are very serious about, is engaging with different actors, religious scholars, Sharia judges, definitely women's rights activists, university students. We do that, and we do that across. And also the linking the local and the global. So we do not see ourselves, and we certainly do not function as a global movement organization telling people in Egypt, UK, and what to do. That's not how we work at all. We are all based in different contexts and come together, and at the same time, people in the local partners, in the context, particular local context, who are part and parcel of Musawah, are the experts in their context, and they take this knowledge and do with it what serves their context. That's the first thing. The thing about, thank you so much for saying that yes, we should do some reflection, all of us, men and women, and also the importance of these ethical values that come from the Quran, but also are universal. And our reason also tells us to go there, as Maryam was saying. But it is also important that the issue of equality, what we're arguing, what I want to highlight is we are arguing for equality, but we don't understand equality as formal equality. Men and women are exactly equal, but we do not argue either for complementarity, which is used as a way to justify unequal rights. But what I want to say is equality is important. The fact that we're talking about values does not mean rights are not important, does not mean legal reform is not important. That is important. But what we're saying is reform and change and engagement and conversation needs to happen at different levels and several levels, not just at the legal level. We also need to revisit these values. And what I and other people are saying also here through our work is, particularly those of us who are working on the Quran, and I would say also usul al-fiqh, like Naveen and Professor Mohsin Kadivar, that equality, which is transformative equality, the way we understand it, actually is not simply something that should be guaranteed to everybody because we are citizens of nation states, we have constitutions that guarantee that. But if we are also interested in this work from a faith-based position, and we're interested really in understanding the theological principles, the messages of this textual tradition, we are arguing there is no way but to argue for equality if you really want to live a life that reflects that theology. So that's the point. About the LGBTQ, we work on the reform of family laws. We are, and that's our main work. And because we work on the family laws, primarily in Muslim majority context, but some of our work definitely is relevant for the minority context, we've been engaging with Islamic textual tradition. Because we are interested in this Islamic textual tradition and its core values, of course, we stand as Musawah against marginalization of all groups, all vulnerable groups. We don't per se, as Musawah, work on LGBTQ, we work on Muslim family laws. And I think every movement, every group needs to work on certain things. You can't work on everything, but we do stand against the marginalization of all groups, of all marginalized people, also not only from a rights perspective, but first and foremost, because we work from within the Islamic tradition, from a theological perspective, that people should not be marginalized and should not face oppression. But we do not work on it. And this is a discussion we can have later, and I would like, if other people want to pitch in, definitely they can pitch in. Yeah.
Deba is going to respond.
Yes, it is on, actually I would say that it is an area that we need to have ihsan more than anywhere else, about any kind of marginalized people. And also, as Mulki said, you know, we are directed by people from the context. In certain contexts, it might be important for them. Who are we to tell them it's not important? But this is not something that we work directly. And I really believe in ihsan. So it is really that compassion, that understanding of humanity. So we are for that. And we are for Musawah, and we are directed by our advocates and their context. And we do not work on it. And you know, we work on the Middle East. And in certain contexts, you cannot even bring the name. And it is used as a label to marginalize, accuse people. And if you talk about equality, it's oh, you want to destroy family. You want to do this. This is really a diversion. And, you know, we must be aware that why people raise this.
Thank you, Ziba. So, oh, sorry, Mariam, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question, Niveen. Indeed, Abdul Jabbar was Mu'tazili and Shafi'i in the same time. And al-i'tizal prevailed in Islamic world until at least the mid of the 11th century. After that, it was the Ash'ari theology that prevailed, and most of the later Shafi'iyya were Ash'a'ira, not Mu'tazila. So if a Shafi'ite scholar today, I don't think he would take into consideration a traditional Shafi'i scholar who is also an Ash'ari, would most probably argue against what is called al-taklif al-aqli, because the Ash'a'ira, they do not acknowledge taklif al-aqli. They think that obligation is only by revelation, and that we are, by reason, we are not obliged or to do certain things, which means that good and evil, right and wrong, they are only based on what is revealed. The implications of the Ash'arite position is that before revelation or apart from revelation, human beings don't know what is right and wrong. Not only that, they don't even know what is truly good and evil. So if a traditional Shafi'i scholar today would be asked about the conditions of moral judgments, he would most probably say that there are no conditions. God can oblige whatever is obliged, and we cannot have any conditions for looking at different obligations, because those obligations are by divine decree, and we cannot question whether they are moral or non-moral. Any obligation, any hukum that is shari'i hukum is divine, and there are no presuppositions that we can question. Of course, that allows scholars, the Shafi'ite or others, to construct their own judgments and still claim that those judgments or ahkam are based on revelation. However, in reality, they are not based on revelation. They are based on their own interpretation of revelation. But they still can claim that those are divine and that they cannot be questioned and that they are not based on reason, and they are simply based on what they think is divine will. So yes, when we talk about the conditions of moral judgments, taklif al-aqli, we are talking about the time when the Shafi'ite fuqaha were very much were also Mu'tazila. However, maybe the other question that is related to this is whether somebody like Qadi Abdul Jabbar himself or other scholars who were Mu'tazila and Shafi'ites actually used those conditions in their fiqh. Because interestingly, I found that in one of the books of Abdul Jabbar, he is considering slavery. And he says what means that, like, if we are considering slavery from a rational perspective, it is slavery is unjust. But then he goes to say, since it is allowed in Sharia, what is allowed in Sharia trumps what is considered justice by reason. So that I found that very interesting, that even the Mu'tazilites, like, they were not always consistent in holding their views, and that's why I don't think that we should advocate like any group or any sect in Islam and think that they are the best and we should bring them back. No. Even the Mu'tazilite theology, like the Ash'arite theology, they should be looked at, they should be studied critically. We should build upon the good ideas, theories that we find there and reject other theories. And of course, I think that is important, that we are critical. We look at the heritage, when we saw, like, whether it is fiqhi heritage or heritage of kalam, we study it with critical eyes, from contemporary perspective, from where we are now, epistemologically and even spiritually. We are definitely in a better position than what the scholars, whether the fuqaha or mutakallimun of the 11th century were. There are many different disciplines, whether it is psychiatry, psychology, anthropology, and other fields of knowledge, which we have to take into consideration when we are looking at different theories that were developed by medieval or pre-modern scholars of Islam. Thank you.
Amira, did you want to add anything to those questions? No? Okay, good. Okay, so we've come to the end of the day. I think I'd like to say a huge thanks to the panel. Can we give them a round of applause, please? And huge thanks to the Musawah team. I know the painstaking hours that you have all put into this. As Shaista said earlier, the Muslim Women's Network UK have been proud to be part of Musawah's journey and have actively used it, particularly the framework to support women here in the UK. The framework and the knowledge itself has given me personally the courage to challenge, whether it's an imam in a local mosque, whether it's secular feminists here in the UK, or the everyday patriarchy that sadly we have to encounter all the time. So my challenge to you all is to really think about what are you going to courageously take forward from what we've heard. So thank you, and I pass now to Zareen.
Thank you very much, Faiza, and our speakers. One last round of applause, everyone. Oh. Long day. You've lasted to the end. Well done. Thank you, everybody. The prize is the knowledge. And with knowledge comes power. With power comes responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, we end our seminar here today. And thank you for being part of our inaugural launch for Justice and Beauty in Muslim Marriage. We are going to translate this book into Arabic, and inshallah, we'll be translating it into other languages in years to come. We are at the end of our seminar, but at the beginning of a very important journey. We were transported back. I still have goosebumps thinking about, all the things that we learned today. Transported back to 600th century, 700th century. We talked about the Romans. We talked about 1950 posters. I remember some of those as well. But we also peeled the concepts and the thinking and the methodology in order to argue for justice, to argue for equality against those who are inherently thinking patriarchal way or whatever it is political Islam has given birth to. However, we now have something that we can argue with, something to talk about, not just having intellectual conversations, but actually distilling this book into very simple words. So I ask you, if you've not bought the book, please buy one. If you've bought one book, please buy two. However, now, the idea is to disseminate, as what we talked about. This book is not just legal, it's not just ethical, it is very spiritual. Read it and you will understand where we come from. We do have a couple of requests behind us. It is so important to get your feedback about the session today. There is this QR code, and if you can please scan it and then give us your feedback on how it went. Am I blocking? Because, we want to make this session effective. It's pointless if we have these sessions and it falls on deaf ears. And I hope you were truly, truly inspired as I was. And I would appreciate if you could just help us disseminate, follow us on our website, do share. Once you've read the book, do give us a book review and email that to us, and that would be also very, very helpful. The Men in Charge book deconstructed the concept of Qawama Wilaya. Justice and beauty is transcending. It's like a warm embrace, pulling it all together, pulling it back, going back to the source and to the core. And I will leave you with that, sitting down, I'm very sorry. And I thank you to our speakers, to our moderators for coming. Big, big, big clap, everyone. To our authors. Sorry? And of course, to the technical team, thank you very much. To Miza, our MC, for standing and keeping time, and to all of you for making time on a Saturday to be with us. Alhamdulillah, we come to a close. Thank you, everyone.